music review for you. This is the 1968 debut release by the English rock and jazz band The Soft Machine. The name, well, that came from a novel called The Soft Machine, written by William S. Burroughs. That young man seems to have had quite a profound influence on the music scene in the late 60s, early 70s, as some reference to one of his novels was also taken on board for the name Steely Dan, and we've already released their debut. This band, Soft Machine, came from Canterbury. They were formed in mid-1966, and they were basically a three-piece. Although initially they were four, Robert Wyatt played drums and vocals, Kevin Ayers was on bass guitar and vocals, David Allen played guitar, and Mick Radlidge was on organ and other assorted keyboards. The problem was that David Allen, who was an Australian, failed to get a visa after the band had been touring in France, and so he wasn't allowed back into the UK. So he stayed in France, formed Gong, and the three-piece came back, although they were also joined by one Hugh Hopper, who played some bass with them and eventually replaced Ayers. But on the first album, he had a minor role, and this album happened in America. The Soft Machine were supporting Jimi Hendrix on his North American tour. They were from the same stable, having Chaz Chandler in as production in both, a manager for both of them, and whilst they were in the States, they recorded their first album in New York City, and that was sort of towards the middle of 1968. So the Soft's first recorded album is really a mixture of the conventional and the avant-garde, and as a result, its real appreciation only comes after 3 or 4 listens. At first hand, this mixture of pop music with jazz music presents quite a few challenges. As Ayers, he's the infectious pop member, and he's quite evident here on this album. And in contrast, we have Radlidge, who's pursuing his jazz elements. Why is the glue really that bridges between these two guys, and his vocals are the sort of the main ingredient. But Wyatt, as we know, also used to like to indulge in drum solos of a jazz nature, and so this would probably lead us to understand how the band moved on after this initial first album. The first side is basically 6 tracks combined into 2 extended pieces. The album does segue throughout, and it tends to alternate between those pops type songs that are sing-alongs, so to speak, followed by sort of organ keyboard drumming type jams, where things certainly get a little bit weird. What's significant, I guess, about them is that you, after a couple of listens, you never really miss the guitar. The great musicianship that was very evident throughout tends to compensate for that. They did actually get compared with Pink Floyd in the early days, and also shared some gigs with them, but they became a completely different animal. And my belief is that actually, as musicians, they were technically far superior than those in Floyd. Their label, though, was very much avant-garde, And let's have a dip into this first sort of side. I obviously had the vinyl, and it was a double set with Soft Machine 2. More of that at a later date. As I said, 2 tracks really, although 6 on the list. We kick off with Hope for Happiness. It's a very inventive song to start. The singing certainly nods to some overdubs. Wyatt with both voices, however, Ayaz didn't do too much singing, and it's interspersed with that raunchy organ and fast drumming that's very much a part of Wyatt's style. And it suggested something special. The energy in the singing, particularly the chorus duet, is infectious, and the intro very original, I thought, with Wyatt's vocals matching the beat to a T. It links. Oh yes, and the lyrics, a whimsical look at how hope erodes as you age. That was my take on it anyway. And it links straight into Joy of a Toy on track 2, which is really when Ayers comes in, dominating this track with his delicately played bass, which has nods to Pastorius a little, although not quite up to that standard. But it builds slowly, ably supported by Wyatt's skippy drums, and then it becomes a crescendo-like as it lurches into Ratledge's Emerson-like keyboard, and then finally it trips back into Hope for Happiness reprise, and so that basically is the first 3 tracks. The next 3 tracks segued together are Why Am I So Short, So Boot If At All, and the third part is called A Certain Kind. Why Am I So Short? Lyrically, it shows us Wyatt's inferiority complex. He was a very short man, and the lyric describes how drumming enabled his stature to blossom because of course, his position. It's a very comical tale, and I like the lyrics. There's an easygoing singing to it, and then that bass working overtime again, with a weird cacophony of deranged keyboards jamming away. It really is progressive jazz rock, but it was so new, interesting, chaotic, and we then moved to the solos, and we're into the second phase, So Boot If At All. And there's a nod to Hendrix's 1983 here, particularly Ayers' bass, which is very avant-garde, and then a neat drum solo by Robert. Ayers is also on piano here, and it gets very spacey. The oddity of the piano very much to the forefront. And finally the vocals return to bridge us into the third part, A Certain Kind. A Certain Kind is a strange piece, a beautiful ballad with church-like organ. The tempo matches the lovely vocal, and the organ rhythmically leads to a choir-like chorus duet. It's very fulfilling, more mood-wide, and it then leads towards another jazz-style finale. The track was written by Hopper, and it certainly has a leaning more to the avant-garde jazz style. The lyrics are nothing special, just a simple expression of love to your partner. And so to side two now, where the next selection are knitted together. If we start off with Save Yourself, it's a much more pop-orientated song, standard organ mixed with wailing style vocals, very Airs-like I felt. He echoes through in the chorus and the melody. A critic suggested it had a Hendrix stamp on it, vis-a-vis Axis Boulder's Love, but I couldn't see that in it at all. Rattledge's organ patterns are vibrant and full of bluster. And what's it about? Hippie talk, I think. Empowering your woman rather than creating a dependency. That's only my view, of course, as I've mentioned before, lyrically. You read them all and you take your own interpretation. We then have the segue on Priscilla, and a lovely instrumental, pleasant and transient, before getting into Lullaby Letter. Now, Lullaby Letter has some epic keyboard solos, and it creates a mood was very popular at the time for organ type music in pop bands. Rattledge is a brilliant keyist, and he's able to convey a sound that enables you to listen without constantly thinking, where is that guitar? The key solos remind me a little of Keith Emerson in The Nice and latterly ALP, and that spirally sound is almost out of control. So to track 10, the chanty We Do It Again. Kevin's on lead here, mind you, it's not exactly his finest hour. One of the only two songs on the record that Kevin Ayres is on lead vocal. And if this is anything to go by, you can understand why. Here it's a real drone-like chant for the first 40 seconds. And then Rattledge builds on it a little to a bridge that returns us to the intro. And the drone continues. Little to report on this. This is definitely a turkey. An excuse for Wyatt's indulgent drumming towards the end as well. Before the segue links us with Why Are We Sleeping? This arrives with a sort of panache, and Kevin's narrative this time is eerie and clown-like. It has a simple enough rhythm. What the hell is it about? I'm not sure. I wrote down on my notes a strange tale, possibly about a gig, with references to David Allen, and how fame starts as an attractive option and then does a U-turn. The song musically simple enough rhythm, but hardly that memorable. And then we reached final track, box 25/4 lid, which is an odd collection of chords and noises, really, that brings the album to a close. I suppose in contrast, really, in looking at the album overall, I think it hasn't aged particularly well. I did really, for a number of years, consider it to be a classic. But now it has its moments, but it's a long way from being up there with the best in 1968. It did illustrate, though, that this band had a lot of talent and it could really move in many different directions. So to summarise, really, an album that hasn't stood the test of time very well, but still's got some remarkable elements to it, and I do like and will continue to like how they segue in the tracks. This was a very innovative development at the time, and hats off to them. And they were clearly a band that took risks, and so they are to be commended for that. I lost touch really with Ayres after he'd left, but I became a great fan of the Soft Machine when they moved heavily into the jazz arena, and I will be reviewing 2 and 3 at a later date. So there we have it. It's the 1968 debut album from the Soft Machine.